So, I want to talk to y'all a little bit about a concept called digital archaeology, specifically as it pertains to Alejandro Ohms, right? This theme or this thread that's been emerging through all of these dialogues. My history is working with artifacts, right? Starting when I was in my mid to late teens, actually, with the Smithsonian American History Museum. This was my first kind of holistic exposure to the importance or the primacy of the artifact in relation to baseball history in terms of an active uncovering of the hidden ontology or the source or the nature of history, right? So my task there was primarily identifying baseballs, right? So I would look at these old baseballs with different signatures on them, some of them very faded, some of them very, very, very old, and going through this process of identification, trying to understand, all right, let's piece together, okay, maybe I can identify a couple of the signatures. Let's piece them together and see exactly when they were clustered in this specific group at this specific time on this specific team, right? So that was kind of my primary thing. They just had archives and archives and archives of baseballs. So I would be there and I would be analyzing these pieces of history, right? Trying to piece them together in order to say this is a relic from here, right? So the idea with this Alejandro Ohms thread is we are doing this concept. I just have a couple of notes here that I'm kind of referring to that I wrote down. Um, we're referring to digital archaeology, right, which is a archive or listings of old baseball artifacts. I think eBay is actually particularly profound in this nature, and I'll go into why in a second. But we're using the artifact as a way to actually uncover and retrieve the like the material soul of baseball history and actually reveal um, essential parts of it to us that previously we didn't know about. So an artifact or a relic can actually reveal a missing node of history through the nature of its preservation and of its existence, right? So I think this is actually a really incredibly profound idea and topic because what this means in terms of the artifact and in terms of material history is that it actually avails us of the possibility of recovery. So you could think of history essentially as a an abyss or an empty. Like we went into these concepts of history as a void, right? And then the responsibility of the historian or the archivist or the uncoverer, the archaeologist, so to speak. And I think archaeology is really the best way to put it because it's digging into the earth, and what that means is a materialism beneath it. Now, that material is the artifact, right? Whether that's an ancient vase or a piece of ostraca from Egypt, or whether that's a statue from Greece that's unearthed from the basin of a certain I don't know, water body of water, right? What we're talking about here is there is an oblivion before the artifact, and the artifact itself, as it's uncovered and revealed through the very intensive process of historical restoration, it recovers a piece of history that previously we did not fully understand. So, this is a postcard that was recovered. It was sold by a older Cuban gentleman, a collector of Cuban baseball artifacts, to a man named Victor, who sells photography in in Miami, Florida. Old photographs and old pieces of Cuban history in general, right? Cuban history in the widest sense as a national uh, process. So there in that nature, right? There's a peeling through the archives of his documents and a limited question and answer that comes with that, as long as or as well as this necessity of a historical reference. Give me a second. I'm just gonna turn off this AC. as well as a historical reference, right, where I have to go through all of the catalog of my baseball knowledge in coalition with old documentary histories, whether it's from newspapers or magazines or tributes. This is a way of remembering Alejandro Ohms, right? From the place of historical ontological dissolution and restoring undocumented history and the unarchived to something resembling an institutional archive, right? Which is digital archivism, which is the creation of books, right? The creation of documents, which recover, restore, and present these images and these pieces of history so that we can understand. So this image here is a postcard from 1918 to 1919 documenting the Tosca team. It's a semi-pro team in Cuba from the sugar mills. And this was a hometown team along with Santa Clara, which was also a semi-pro team at the time, that Alejandro Ohms played for, right? So I have this broader knowledge, and this is available by way of SABR, by way of different Negro Leagues and Cuban Leagues historians, right? By different biographical tributes, even the tribute that was created for the memorial plaque that was created for Alejandro Ohms on, I believe, his 130th anniversary of his birth in Cuba. So there's a variety of different documents that you're sifting through. You're trying to identify, okay, Alejandro Ohms did play consistently for Tosca from 1915 to 1920, but furthermore, right, how can we confirm that he is precisely documented in this image? So you're doing a process, and I'm just going to show you here. You're doing this process of it's almost like facial recognition, right, where you're trying to identify essential attributes of the face in these photographs, right? So I have this image here. It's just crazy to do this kind of work, especially all over screens and all over digital devices, because you're looking at images with different statuses and standards of quality. Then furthermore, the artifacts themselves can be highly corrupted, right? And what I mean by corrupted is corroded by light and corroded by time, but particularly by light. So I'm going to show you another image here. This is a really powerful one. Really powerful, because this is from the same collector from the same time period, and you can see the corrosion of the image, right, which actually makes facial identification near impossible for the first maybe 4, 5, 6, even 7 figures in this image, right? So half of the document itself creates this problem of identification, this problem of knowledge, and this to me is actually incredibly profound, because this again speaks to history, right? The ontological dissolution of time, which creates an impossibility of knowing and understanding. And what we're doing when we're moving through these archives is attempting to understand and attempting to know these essential details. So I have here the back of that postcard that I just showed you. This documents the 1919 championship of the Villas on the 28th of September against Remedios, where Tosca actually won. And Remedios was actually a pretty well-renowned semi-pro team from this era. In 1915, they played the American Federal League team, the St. Louis Terriers, in Cuba. And this was actually, they were part of a Cuban Federal League, which was named accordingly, right? It was named after that American Federal League. So you have this time period, right, of Tosca, and the way that this kind of helped me turn the lock here between these two images was the presence of the, if you can see third from the left, the young child, right, that's there sitting next to who I very much so believe to be a young Alejandro Ohms, just to the right of him, and then to the left of the young child, the two brothers that Ohms played with on this Tosca team. And I'm just going to get you their names really quick here. So his little brother was named Pedro. And let me just pull this up. Oh, yes. And then his brothers Pablo and Eleuterio were on the team with him, right? And so you can see how they are seated, right? It's a huge key to me. They're seated very close together, very physically close together, even almost separated from the rest of the group, right? And so when I go through the backlogs of existing archived, at least digitally archived images of Alejandro Oms, you really have nothing before 1922, 1923, when he really started to rise in the Cuban professional ranks, most notably with the Santa Clara Leopardos, one of the most famous Cuban baseball teams of all time, professionally. So you're already dealing with a time delineated difference just in terms of the facial features and recognition of Alejandro Oms, because these pictures that are on record are of him that much older. Furthermore, he got tuberculosis between the period of 1915, 1918, all the way up into the early and mid 1920s. So you're dealing with an added thing that significantly changed the physical status of his body, the way that he looked, his posture, his everything, right? It's a significant illness to contract. You're already dealing with that. Layer number 2 is the corrosion of the archival document, and the difficulty, right, in terms of the clarity of the physical print object, referring to both of these postcards, right, but particularly the one with the corrosion of light. Extreme difficulty, really, of the high definition, high quality image rendering that's possible here, right? And then furthermore, it's an image that's being conveyed digitally by a owner of a photography shop in Miami who purchased this from an older Cuban gentleman. There's that layer. And then additionally, there is the layer of the family history of Alejandro Oms, which I think is profoundly interesting. And actually, to me, it was kind of the key that finally turned this lock. Because I can do facial recognition. I can go back through these historical documents. I can confer with Cuban baseball historians, right? I can do a number of different things to create this process of verification. But you're ultimately dealing with this fundamental level of the semi-pro sugar mill team leagues in Cuba pre-1920 are barely documented, if at all. There is one key here that did significantly help me. Here you go. Alejandro Oms, before beginning his career in professional Cuban baseball, played for various local teams in Santa Clara, such as Pastora and Dubargueñas, before eventually joining Tosca. Precisely, it was with that team that Tosca, a name taken from the famous Puccini work and opera, made its first foray into the province of Matanzas on January 22nd, 1920. The presentation of the famous amateur team took place in Calimete, on the field located at the corner of Castaneda Street, on the San Pablo farm, near the local cemetery, according to historian Jesus M. Fernandez Gonzalez. Along with El Caballero Oms, the gentleman, called so for his exemplary conduct, the team included his brothers Pablo and Eleuterio, as well as a phenomenal pitcher named Armando Lopez, who blanked the Calimete boys 6-0. At bat, Alejandro was sensational, going 4 for 4 with 2 doubles and a home run. Right? So one of the big clues there, right, is it verifies that he was active all the way up into 1920, which then would include this period of time, 1918 to 1919, of which the backs of these postcards document, thanks to who I can only assume was the team historiographer. Looks like the name reads Mario Garcia, right? So he's documenting these events, and this here is the back of the postcard with the image clarity that I showed you, which includes Alejandro and his 3 brothers, which documents it was like a doubleheader game against another local team that occurred during this same time period. So that was one big thing. And I'll show you the second. It's the idea that his younger brother, Pedro, was identified as the team mascot of the winter team in Santa Clara in 1921. Right, and there's another article that I had that also identified his younger brother Pedro as a mascot. Let's see. Yeah. Santa Clara, 1921, with the four Ohms brothers: Alejandro, right field; Tito, first base; Eleuterio, pitcher; and Pedro, the team mascot. Right? So this is a really essential cluster, right, of the entire. You don't know, right? But the siblings, the Ohms siblings, that are all participating in this act and event of baseball together. So what we're looking at here really is, as far as I'm aware, right, in the digital archive world, potentially, I mean, there's a physical copy that might be entirely undocumented digitally. There might be someone, in terms of Cuban baseball historian, that's aware of this information that has not published it, at least digitally. But the four Ohms brothers together on the Tosca team, right? We know that Eleuterio and Tito played. Let me just make sure I have all the names. Yes, Eleuterio, Tito, and Alejandro all played together on Tosca as well as Santa Clara in that winter of 1921. We know that his little brother Pedro was the mascot of that Santa Clara team, but what we're looking at is Pedro also kind of sitting in that mascot role, at least in this image, for the 1920 or the 1918 to 1919 Tosca team. As far as I'm aware, none of these images even exist. I mean, Santa Clara, Tosca, any of them, which actually documents these four brothers sitting together in a group photo in that semi-pro environment. And this would also be and is the youngest image of Alejandro Ohms that exists on record, at least digitally, and that's been digitally archived, right? And that was one of the keys for me, because I was going back and forth between these two postcards. You can see here you have a different kind of younger mascot figure who's sitting in on this photograph. This one for me was much more difficult, because you're looking at, okay, how do I identify in this image with the amount of artifact corrosion? And this is exactly what I mean by historical restoration, right? The process of restoring history. Because what that really means is it's a kind of a race against time, right? Like an image like this or an artifact like this, you could speculatively say this is an image document of Alejandro Ohms at this critical formative part of his career, playing semi-professional baseball with Tosca between 1915 and 1918, and playing on the 1919 championship team, which is documented here against Remedios. But what time has done and the corrosion of light has done is we've lost the ability to preserve that or restore that definitively. There could be object or artifact restoration done here by professional curators, but I'm not sure how much that would do to actually restore the image quality where the light has corroded it. Right? So then you return to this one, and this, again, this is just the strangeness and power of history, in that this artifact may be the only artifact that remains. Right? This may be the only way to actually recover this essential part of history in terms of visual documentation. The most sophisticated knowledge that's available, whether that's SABRE, whether that's Negro Leagues restoration projects, whether that's Cuban Leagues restoration projects, the only real information that's available, other than that one game that I elucidated to you that documented the play of Ohms on Tosca with his brothers, right? A real game historiography by that Cuban historian whose name was Jesus M. Fernandez Gonzalez. The January 22nd, 1920 game where Tosca was presented in Matanzas against the Calimete local team, including Armando Lopez, right, who actually does have just like a couple of pictures, 1 to 2 to 3 pictures digitally that document Lopez, and I believe he's standing right behind Ohms in this picture, smiling there. And that was another facial recognition project that I had to run, right? I had to just try to identify through facial structure and recognizable attributes: face, nose, lips, eyes, distance of eyes, ears, posture, body type, the whole thing, right? So other than that one game, all you have and all you know is that from 1915 to 1919, Ohms played the majority of his time on this Tosca team, and he played with his two brothers, right? And that's not even fully documented everywhere. That's only documented on a couple of different archival sources. The key is this local familial relationship that's here, right? With his two brothers that played on the team with him. And then again, that added layer and added level of understanding that in the winter of 1921, Pedro was the team mascot for the Santa Clara team, his younger brother, who was far too young to play. Again, this is something that I actually think I had another source verify that as well, but for the Tosca team, that Pedro was the mascot for as well, at least for a brief period of time. Let me see if I can just pull it. So if you can see what I'm doing here, right? And what is really required. What's required is a really extensive process of digging deeply into this archaeology, which really represents at its deepest level the semi-pro sugar mill teams, the local teams in Cuba, through which many of the greatest players or the great players in the Cuban leagues rose, right? This is something that's very, very, very undocumented and unarchived and unrestored. There is work that has been and is being done on this topic, but to understand this is the real archaeological context of Alejandro Ohms's professional life. This is his youth and his time playing with his brothers on this local semi-pro team. To understand and to know that these artifacts still exist at any level and in any quality is itself the capacity to restore that missing node of history and reveal a deeper layer than we ever knew or understood before. And so in this way, right, I talked about going into the ground or going into the earth. This again aligns with the sort of underworld of history and the Orphic underground that I discussed, right, which is going into the earth, retrieving the material soul in the soil of the earth through this artifact, which was believed to be dead or believed to be missing or gone, right? And that restoration project is bringing that object or artifact or relic up into the light and saying, hey, here it is, right? Here's a piece to this puzzle. Here's a way that we can see, know, and understand and get closer and get deeper into real relationship with history and the humanity of history and the history of humanity, right? And this is just incredibly powerful when it comes to Alejandro Ohms because he is already someone who is so under-recognized and underrepresented in the archive itself, right? Again, going back to the concept of undocumented history and the unarchived. I mean, being a Black Cuban man born at the cusp of Cuba's liberation and just after the abolition of slavery in Cuba, there's such a profound foothold there in history. Again, in terms of Cuban baseball itself, which is just not being acknowledged at the level it needs to, right? And then Alejandro Ohms being this Black Cuban man in Cuban professional baseball, who arguably is one of the greatest global players of all time. There's just so much there. It's such rich space. And to see and feel his humanity here, I mean, looking at the photo itself and the way he's positioned, right? If you look at a lot of the photos of Alejandro Ohms, you can really get the sense from his presence, from his stature, from his facial expression. He has such a unique form to him and way of carrying himself. Let me see if I can pull up something else that perhaps shows it. But when you look at those images of Ohms, right, especially the ones that are already documented, you get the sense of a man who is incredibly intelligent and sensitive and present, right? Especially in terms of the stories that are communicated about him. You have a Cuban historian who wrote about him at the time of his death, a sports journalist, Eladio Cicadas, signed a moving tribute, a portion of which was placed on the marble monument at the 130th anniversary of his life that commemorates him in Cuba. Let me read it here. Alejandro Ohms wasn't simply a baseball player. He was a master by vocation because skill came from his soul. When a sport is practiced like this, as Kid Chocolate practiced boxing, it fully enters the category of art. Alejandro Ohms' naturalness was clear, precise, and well-honed. He achieved feats effortlessly. To look like a great baseball player, he only had to put on the uniform. His feet were firm, his chest held high, his pupils alert, his divine stakes ready. The pitchers of his era both respected and feared him. Over the years, they hadn't been able to find his weak spot. Greatness in almost all sports is a matter of harmony. Stardom rarely emerges when there isn't a balanced rhythm between skill and strength. A player who hits a lot and fields little, and the one who is eminent on defense and weak on offense, may advance greatly, but never reach the threshold of posterity. Alejandro Ohms is equally forgettable in both sports. Combined, both factors create the combined work of one of the most complete Cuban outfielders of all time, perhaps the best. The most compelling aspect of Alejandro Ohms was his sobriety. He gave the impression that his brilliance and efficiency were mechanical, within the reach of any artistic talent. He would step into the field at the crack of the hit. The second gained by the privileged is the time lost by baseball's journeymen, who then have to make up for the delay with titanic stretches and circus-like somersaults. Alejandro Ohms was an outfielder without fanfare or trapeze. He had the stage poise and natural ease of Joe DiMaggio, capable of conveying to anyone new to the baseball challenge the unreal idea that anyone can put on baggy pants, put on a cap, grab a glove, and go out and play center field. So really profound and moving tribute there. And this is kind of the real idea here, and it just circles back to really everything we've been talking about, which is the recovery of the humanity, right? The humanity and the soul and the spirit beneath history. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through the artifact, through the relic. And especially in the cases where, as we've been discussing with this postcard here, history is restored in a way that there is no memory of, that's been documented, at least in a digital context, right? We don't know if this has been documented on a piece of paper or even a booklet that's been created by a Cuban historian anytime between now and then, right? And that's precisely what an artifact like this reveals. And so then there's this responsibility in a historical curatorial sense to restore this archive or this archival information to the light of day, right? And to restore it in a broad sense, digitally, so it can be remembered and preserved, as well as through books, right, as well as through documents, and making sure all of those are then archived properly for the next generation or wave of people who then become historians of this increasingly broader gulf of history and of time, right? And so the presence of an artifact like this is probably the most profound statement that history can give, which is to say something remains, and here is what remains. And this artifact then can give us contact and context, and return us to where is the history and where is the image, and provide us light where there otherwise was darkness and oblivion. And in this way, right, we can do this act of historical recovery through a group or communal effort, right? All of the documents and all of the photographs that I referenced, whether those were by older Cuban baseball sports journalists, historians, documentarians of the Negro Leagues or the Cuban Leagues, as well as the Saber Biography Project, all of these are different community ways of preserving this history and deepening it, right? And so an artifact like this adds to that. It deepens it in a critical way, because it takes us further into time. It takes us deeper into the origins of Alejandro Ohms, and it shows us the way that his relationships with his brothers really formed this critical moment just before his transformation into the Cuban professional baseball star that he became, right? This semi-pro moment, this local sugar mill team moment with the Tosca team, for those 5 years, 1915 to 1920, before he took that step into the Cuban professional leagues and became one of the greatest baseball players of all time. And you can see this, right? You can see the formation of himself as an individual, and in terms of how he's sitting here. He's sitting very internally withdrawn, even as he's the center of the photo, which was typical, right? You have the best players seated in towards the center, or you have them standing in the center, right? He's centralized in the image along with Armando Lopez. They're two great players, and Armando Lopez achieves a level of renown in the Negro Leagues and Cuban leagues as well. This is just a way, and I think with the term digital archaeology, it's the most powerful thing to me, or just archaeology itself in a historical context, because it is very much so digging into the earth and recovering the artifact, right? And this is possible digitally. It's a lot of what I've done and what my work has been, whether that's through international bookstores or photography stores or what have you, right? Or yeah, you name it. The idea there is sifting through history and having the eye, right? Having the eye, which is the education of baseball history and global history, to understand, all right, this is a specific moment or an important crux, and then going through that process of identification, which is the facial recognition, which is the posture, the tone of the individual present, right? Alejandro Ohms is almost very obvious to me in this picture because of the way that he's seated. Very, very withdrawn. The sensitivity is present, as well as the facial structure, which I showed you in that previous photo here, right? So this is it's a very sensitive thing to do, especially when there's obscuration, right? His hat brim is pulled down low. He's not trying to make himself seen or known, particularly in this photo. The photograph of the photo itself, sent by the Cuban baseball or the Cuban history store in Florida itself, is not particularly great either, right? So we're looking at these levels of quality of the artifact, again alluding to that second photo with the corroded light, that make this is difficult, right? It's difficult to understand and difficult to see. So there's those levels of presence and sifting and contextualizing that's so integral to digital archaeology. And then again, right, the utter importance of this project, which is to just add layers and deepen knowledge and awareness and understanding of Alejandro Ohms' life, especially in a critical moment like this, right? Where he is still local. He's still at home with his brothers, and he's taking those steps into immortal, eternal baseball history with the greatness that he achieved. And I just think this is a great image to show that that relationship and that bond, especially as a very young person. He's just barely 20 years old in this photo. So I appreciate your guys' time here. I think this is really important stuff, and I will catch you on the next one.